In today's video, we're going to cover some basic router tips that I have for anyone who's either just gotten a router table or is about to get a router table and wants to get a little more information ahead of time. The first thing we're going to cover are basic safety tips. When it starts to get cool out, it's a little cooler today, I have to wear long sleeve things in the shop because this isn't a climate controlled shop. Rolling our sleeves up is an absolute must. There is no long sleeve that we should be using around this. Even if you have to just take off your jacket, if you're wearing one of those for when you're going to use this, do that. Up next is any sort of necklace, dangling watches or jewelry. Absolute no. There is no saw stop for routers. It will spin, and if it catches anything, it will pull. But I do think that this is a tool that can be used pretty safely. So just make sure nothing can get caught inside of the router bit as it spins. After that, we have basic hand awareness. We want to know where the bit is and know where our hands are at all times, as when we're doing any kind of router table work, our hands are going to be relatively close. Now we have different things that can help us control pieces and remove our hands, but it's mostly hand manipulation that's going on. So keeping an eye on the peripheral of where your hands are at all times is very important. Don't get hyper focused only on exactly where the bit is and accidentally walk your hand right into it. After that, we've got table height. Now this is one that's going to depend a lot on the user. I like to keep mine at about waist height. I know these are called bench tops, but I would not put it on a bench or you're going to be working up here, which I think is a really bad idea. Router tables can kick back and you absolutely do not want it at face level. A lot of the control is based on how you use pressure. I don't like to have just my triceps doing the pressure if it's up high. I like to be able to use a little bit of my pecs and my chest and all of that. So think about the height of your table, especially if you've got a bench top and you're going to build something to sit it on. I suggest starting with around waist height and getting a feel for that. After that, we have dust and eye protection. Absolutely, you need to be using some kind of mask or eyeglasses. If you have really good dust collection with a dust collector, you might be able to get away with a mask not being on every time, but I highly suggest it because this will spin dust in every direction and it will go all over the place unless you have quite a powerful vacuum and something pulling the dust out really efficiently. You can also get little chips that'll fly off if you're taking a really big cut, something a little too deep, and they can fly up and go towards your eyes. We also don't want to be wearing gloves around the router bit. I know there are some people who tend to want to wear gloves in the workshop just as hand protection. Big no-no when it comes to the router. If that catches, it will pull your entire hand in, and your arm and strength is not going to be able to fight that. Up next, we're going to cover a few tips related to the setup of your router table. The first one is that in almost any router table you get or router insert you get, there's going to need to be some sort of leveling mechanism. That's going to be different depending upon the router table, and some may not have that. But if you have the ability to level, we actually don't want it to be perfectly level. We want it to be slightly below the table on our in-feed side and slightly above the table on the out-feed side to make sure that we never get a workpiece hitting any of those contact points on the way through. One of the most dangerous things that can happen with a router table is that when you're in the middle of a cut, you bump into something. And then if you're using a featherboard, you can't go back, you may be trapped somehow, and then you got to use your knee to kick off the power, or you don't have a way to kick off the power. So slightly lower on the in-feed side, and I'm talking just enough that you can feel it with your hand, or if you take something like a ruler, if you come from the inside, you should just feel yourself touching it, and then on the outfeed side, just feel yourself touching it. We don't want it too much, or else our workpiece is not going to have the same depth of cut as we go through. So not perfectly level, just a hair below on the in-feed and a hair above on the out-feed. After that, one of the tricky things about router tables is when you set up the fence, depending upon where your lighting is, you can create a natural shadow. If your lighting is behind the fence angle, you will have a dark area there where it gets a little harder to see. Now, if you can, as many lights as possible in a shop is a good idea, but I have a little camping headlamp that I wear. I love having direct light at all times, no matter what I'm doing, and that makes sure that even if my body is blocking some light or the fence is, I have perfect light at all times. So really think about if you have the ability to decide where you're going to put your table in the shop, making sure that you've got some light above, slightly behind, off to each side, so that no matter where you stand, you're getting good lighting. Or if you're like me, grab a little camping headlamp and wear it for when you're doing the routing. Most routing tables and routing plates are going to come with a variety of insert rings. Now there's a couple reasons we would want to choose a specific one. Obviously, bit size is the first one. Certain bits are only going to fit through certain holes just due to the diameter of the bit. But we're also going to be thinking about the size of our workpiece, the width of our workpiece. I often like to leave the largest ring in there when possible because I have dust collection that pulls under. And because it's so powerful, it will pull almost all the dust underneath. But if I'm using my fence, I like to feed it both ways. What are you doing down there? What are you doing? What are you doing down there? Huh? What are you doing? However, if you are going to leave the largest insert ring in there, like I do most of the time, there are going to be cases where you're going to want to pull it out and have something smaller. And the first of those is when you're using a workpiece whose width is narrower than this opening. One of the most dangerous things that can happen, and one thing that can ruin a project, is if you're putting pressure and you dip in on the way in and dip in on the way out. Not only can that cause some kickback and grabbing, but it's going to leave you, let's say you're doing a groove along this way with a deeper area here and a deeper area here. If you have a piece narrower than this, you're going to want to put the smallest insert ring you can possible so that we have support on both sides. There's no real zero clearance for most router bits. Some companies sell a plate where you can drill your own hole to get as close as you can. But in the case of most of these, it's just for support. So in general, use the smallest one you can unless you have a lot of dust collection below and you're using a big enough piece that dipping in is not going to be a big issue. One thing you'll find in the box of most routing tables and leveling plates is a pin of some type, and there will be a hole generally on the right-hand side of the router bit that this screws into. And what that's mainly for is what I call freehand routing. It's when we're using some kind of bearing guided bit and we're not using a fence of any type and we're freehanding it through there. This allows us a contact point so that when we enter our cut, we have something we can also brace against. Now, I often use a lot of things that I can't have this here because it gets in the way. I'm needing to go all the way around. But in general, if you're just starting out and you're wanting to get a feel what it's like to enter and exit the cut, which we'll talk about in a second here, put this pin in there. It can be a big important part of extra safety when using, and it just gives you a little extra stability as you're going along. Up next, I want to talk a little bit about the fence. Now, I put this on backwards to make it easier to see from this angle. So the fence doesn't go this way, it faces towards you. But on a lot of benchtop tables, you do not have some kind of rail system. If you've got enough money and you've bought a really nice router table, a full-size one, a lot of times they have a rail system that keeps this at 90 degrees at all time to the bit. But on a lot of benchtop ones, lesser expensive ones, this is free floating. Now that may seem like an odd issue because we know from the table saw that we always want the fence to 90 degrees. But there's a main difference here that allows this to be okay. When I first got my table, I thought it had to be 90 degrees at all time, and I would get a square out and I would try to square it out. It was an absolute mess. It took forever. But what I eventually learned is that a router bit has a cutting point, I guess I'll call it, directly in the center of the bit. A table saw only goes in one direction. This spins 360 degrees. This means that the center of the cutting point is always the distance from the center of the fence, no matter which angle we have it at. So it's okay if you're cutting on something like the Craig table and this fence is at a slight angle. It doesn't actually matter. As long as the distance you want of your cut is the correct amount away from the fence, you can feed it whatever angle. You don't have to get out a square and keep this at 90 degrees at all time. If you want it 3 inches away, it's the same this way as it is this way, as long as this distance from the bit to the center is 3 inches no matter what. The next thing we need to think about is our power button. If you have not bought an on and off switch, to turn the power on, you have to manually do it. Now this is something you have to think about ahead of time. If you've bought, let's say, the Craig plate, or you've bought this router table but not the router lift, you have to mount the router yourself on there using the base of the router. It's important ahead of time to think about when you're putting the router in, how the power button is going to be located in regards to you standing in the front. You have numerous angles that you can mount this on if you've got a plate that's not pre-drilled, or you can mount it in 3 different directions. So I suggest if you're doing something like the normal plate where you have to use your own fixed base, that you put, boy, that's dusty, that you put the router in, take a look at where the power button is, and then orient how you're going to put this in relative to that. You want access to it. Now we'll touch a little later on some accessories, and I really think a paddle on and off switch, whether you get the Craig branded one for the Craig table or a generic one, it's incredibly nice to have. It allows you in emergency cases to use your knee to turn it off if you've got your hands and you're holding. Having to reach under there and turn it on and off, I don't love it. I think it's certainly dangerous. You suddenly have to get down by the router. I'd invest even in a $20, $25 paddle on and off if you can. But if you're not going to, just think ahead of time about how you're mounting this so that the power button is facing you in a place where you can easily turn it on and off and you don't have to walk around the router or something like that while it's spinning. And the final one in regards to setup is you may or may not want to wax your table. Now the Craig table has this interesting design where it's got hundreds, maybe thousands of little dimples, and that's to reduce friction and to provide little air pockets essentially so the piece slides better. However, even with this table, in the most humid times of summer, you'll feel a little kind of stickiness, and some paste wax is really good. If you've got a cast iron top, you absolutely need to be using some sort of topping for that, whether it's paste wax or some of the more expensive varieties. But if you're just using a phenolic top of some sort and you're getting any kind of sticking, just grab your normal paste wax and go ahead and apply a layer on there, put it on, wait a few minutes, polish it off. Do that every few weeks and it will stay really nice and slick. In this section, we're going to cover what I call feed and speed, and that's the speed of the router bit, the speed of the feed rate, and the direction of the feed rate, as well as how to manipulate that feed rate and feed direction to improve your results. Now, the first thing we need to cover is that a router bit in a router table spins counterclockwise, and we always want to be feeding, I shouldn't say always, but 99% of the time, we want to be feeding into the cutter head. So if you hold a router bit and you just spin it counterclockwise, you'll see that the cutters are coming at you if you are on the outside of the bit. If you go the other way, you're going to be hitting the outside of the bit all the time and you wouldn't be able to make a cut for the most part. That we'll again touch on that in a second. So always remember, when you're standing in front of your router table, it's spinning counterclockwise and we want to be going into the bit. We do not want to be coming left to right. We want to be going right to left for the vast majority of cuts. We then also have to discuss bit speed. Most routers these days are variable speed, meaning you can crank up or down the rotations per minute. They often don't have the RPM numbers on them. They just have some setting 1 through 6. The reason that's important is because router bits come in very different sizes, from everything as small as a 1/8 inch spiral bit all the way up to giant 2 1/4 inch kind of cabinet panel shaping bits. But in the end, all we need to really know is that the bigger the bit is, the slower we need to go. I have a general rule of thumb that if it's under an inch, I stick it at 6 unless I'm having some other problems. And if it's over an inch, I kick it down to 5. And then for every about ½ inch above there, I either try it at 5 and then go down if need to. Most people are not going to have to go lower than 5 because most people aren't going to be using bits on a router table that are a whole lot bigger than 1 1/4 inch, 1.5 inches. But if you're getting some burning, anything like that, try going down the speed, even with smaller bits. There's a couple variables you can play with to deal with that. Bit speed is one of them. Try slower or try faster if you're getting some burning on a smaller bit, but don't crank all the way up to full speed on anything 1 inch or over. After that, we have the feed rate, meaning the speed at which we're pushing the piece of wood past the router bit and into the cut. One of the biggest problems with routers is that you can get some problems on either side of the right speed. You can get burning and tear out if you're going too fast or too slow. There's a very happy medium in the middle. And I think what I would consider to be about 1.5 inches per second of movement would be roughly the speed I would like to go for a bit that's 1 inch or under, and it's not a super tiny bit, and it's not some giant profile bit. 1.5 inches, 1 inch per second is okay. So if you think about that, if you've got an 8-inch board, it should take you between, 6-ish to 8-inch seconds to get through the router bit. Now, you obviously don't need to be counting in your head, but if you want to count to get an idea early on, just count and look for about 1 inch to 1.5 inches every second for feed. Now, some of this is going to change based on how deep of a cut you're taking. I don't like to take more than 1/8 of an inch off at once. Sometimes you can get a little more than that. And you could probably get away if you've got feather boards with taking a little more off on something like a profile bit and you're using the fence. But if you're using these big chunky profile bits, absolutely take multiple passes. On this guy right here, which I think is a 1/2-inch cove bit, I'd take this in 3 passes probably. I would not try to hog this out all in one, and you might be able to push it to 2, but you got to really know what you're doing with how you're holding your workpiece if you're going to take that much out. And then I want to talk about the exceptions to what I discussed earlier, and that's the infamous climb cut. Now, a lot of times people will say, don't do this, but I think it's important to at least know what it is so that if you do end up in a situation and you are going to do it, you at least have an idea ahead of time. What a climb cut involves is essentially going the opposite direction, and it's mostly used to avoid bad tear out. A lot of times when you're routing something that's got kind of wild grain, or you're doing a multi-curved bit, you're going to be going with the grain one direction and against the grain the other. And when you're going the wrong way with the grain, it usually wants to try to tear it out. Now, the first thing you should do to avoid this is take smaller passes. But if that's still causing you tear out, what I like to do is I like to isolate along the piece where I'm getting the tear out. And if I'm getting it in just a specific spot, which is usually what happens, I like to mark that out, carry it over to what will be the top side. And then I like to do a short climb cut in that area. And a climb cut essentially involves, and I will show this in a minute, engaging the router bit in the right direction and then coming back. And you have to really pay attention to how you're holding this, because this can go very wrong very fast. But it allows the bit to go then with the grain, essentially to minimize tear out. It's not the safest thing in the world. A lot of people will say never do it, and you almost always can get away with things normally. You almost never have to do it, but a lot of times I find that if there is going to be some tear out, it's only going to be in like 1 inch or 2 of an area where the grain is going a different direction, and I will engage in doing a climb cut in that situation to avoid having to do a ton of sanding later. It doesn't eliminate all tear out in some cases, but it will reduce the amount of sanding you'll have to do later. And if taking small shallow cuts is just not working, sometimes you have to do it. So we're going to go through now, and I'm going to show you up close how to enter the cut, the feed rate that we're looking for, and then the appropriate way in which I would do a climb cut. To view these cuts, I've made one piece which I think essentially encompasses most of the edge profiling type cuts you're going to have to make. We've got straight edge, end grain, internal curves, and external curves, as well as a flat spot that transitions into curves both ways. This kind of covers most of the freehand routing, which is when you're not using the fence and you're using a bearing-based bit. This does not cover flush trimming. We'll cover that a little bit later, but this is for edge profiling free-handed. So I'm going to show you up close how I would approach each of these things. I've thrown on a 1/4 inch roundover bit here because I think this will help demonstrate, for the most part, these techniques in an easy way. I didn't want to pick one that was too big because then you wouldn't be able to see the other side of the wood as I'm going around. So we're going to start off with the principle of how to enter a cut. And in general, if it's possible, it's best to enter on a straight area, not necessarily on an edge if you don't have to. And you're going to want to come in, and as you're moving, roughly parallel, perhaps with a slight angle, to the center of the bit and to where you're standing along the miter gauge, and just kind of gently push in as you go. I don't love coming on an edge like this. I would much prefer, especially if you can go all the way around something, to enter on a flat spot somewhere, a straight area. You're coming in, you're just pressing. And once you've engaged, there's a lot more control once you're against that bearing, and you can then go through. If you do leave the cut, let's say you've gotten to here, and you're trying to get around this area, right? This is a tricky one. This would be a little difficult. Instead of trying to pull off, readjust, and then go around, what I suggest doing is pulling off, readjusting, and then starting a little bit before where the cut is, where you've already removed some material, instead of cutting exactly where you left off and then rotate. So we're going to enter in, and I'm going to end up doing all of this, and I'm going to take a bit of a beefy cut, and I hope we get a little tear out. We'll probably get it either in here or somewhere around here. to then cover the climb cut and see the difference. Like I said, always start out with a shallower pass because you'll be able to identify problems earlier on there and then know where you have to isolate and deal with that later. If you do not have an obvious flat straight area to enter, what I suggest doing is kind of finding your own. And we can manipulate the board to do that because we're really just looking for an area that's roughly parallel and as straight as we can get. It doesn't have to be a long area. So let's say I only have to do this side. I don't get to do this side because for some reason I don't want to round it over. Well, I would manipulate this piece actually more at an angle so that this area here becomes my new flat spot. Let's say I was doing this only here. I would come in and I would go, if we're pretending this isn't here and I've just got this weird bump, I would come in like this, and now I've got a flat spot here relative to the bit, assuming again this part is not there, it's just a weird bump. I'm coming in, I'm finding a flat spot, I'm making a straighter area. It's much easier to do that than to try to engage kind of on the apex of a turn, as you get a little more reference area. All right, in that one segment, I believe I showed everything that I was just talking about. I don't think I forgot anything. You saw me entering on the straight edge. I'm not entering right here on the corner. You saw me entering and changing positions where I am going back to somewhere I've already removed material and then starting again. We saw the flat spot entering on a curve as well as up here. I'm entering that way. We're coming around and then we're flipping around like this. That pretty much is every sort of technique I have in regards to how to enter cuts, make turns, and all of that. You get a feel for it over time. You get a feel for the right angle. It's a little hard to describe, and even picturing it, you're going to have to just have a little, confidence in going yourself and try it for the first time. But what I'm looking for here, and here we got some. We've got tear out between here and here, and exactly in the corner where I thought here and here. And that's because we are suddenly changing direction on the grain. We're not nicely going across, we're now going up and out, and we're going up and out. And that led to some tear out. You can see right here this tear out in this area here. And it's just that kind of little, it's almost hard to see on here. And then we'll come over here and you can see it in the bottom corner right there. That is what router tear out looks like. And this is actually not bad. Okay, so once we've identified our tear out, in this case from here to here for me, and then here to here, the nuclear option is the climb cut. And the first way I'm going to approach this is I'm going to transfer my marks onto this side so I know that this area and then this area through here are my problem areas. And I only am going to be dealing with the climb cut in those two areas. Now, essentially what we're going to have to do is we're going to enter normally somewhere slightly past where our problematic area is. So for this one, this area here, I'm going to enter up here. This one's going to be a little more problematic, and I'm probably going to enter up in this top area here where I've got some flat space. So this isn't the greatest idea. And honestly, you may want to enter here, but you're going to have to be doing so a little bit of rotating. You know what? Actually, we're going to enter here. We'll enter over here and just carry it around because I think that's going to be easier than trying to nail the landing spot on this little guy. And so we're going to go in and I'm going to create my flat spot here. I'm going to enter and I'm going to stop. I'm not going to keep going. I'm going to stop, and now I've got 2 points of contact with my hand and a point of contact with the bearing. And I can rotate now without leaving this cut. And I'm going to just rock it back until we get just past our line. And then you can either exit there or then go back and just continue with your cut, because that area will have had the material removed and you should be okay. And like I said, for this one up here, I think we're going to enter here and then we're going to rock back. And when you do these climb cuts, this should only be on the final light pass. You don't want to have to be doing this with a beefy pass, because it's not the safest thing in the world, as you're essentially allowing the bit to carry momentum with you as you're going back already. So only do this on a very light pass on the end just to clean up some tear out. And this tear out, like I said, I would honestly not be that bothered by that. That's an easy hand sand, but that's all we got to work with here, so I'm just going to show it on this. So that worked really well, and we cleared up almost all of it there. That's just going to take a little swipe or two of sanding. And we cleaned up almost all of it there. Hopefully you can see from the image before or the video before and then to now that works really well. It's really a good way to clean out tear up. It's just not the ideal way, I guess would be how I'd put that. In an ideal world, your bit is nice and sharp, you get no tear out. And if you do, it's no more than this, and you just take some sandpaper swipes. But I've had times on really nasty grained wood where it's just taken a chunk out. I mean, straight up like a splinter has been taken right out. I don't replace my bits as often as I should. I'm a little stingy with my money sometimes, and I'll let it get too dull, and I'll just have this big chunk taken right out of there. And it can be disastrous. It can ruin an entire piece. Again, not a beginner technique per se, but something that you may end up thinking I want to do. And while I don't advise doing it until you've really learned how to work your router, if you're going to do it, there's at least a demonstration of how it should be done. In my opinion, from what I've learned, that's how I do it. Up next, I want to cover a few things about the fence of a router table, specifically on these benchtop ones, but some of this applies, or much of it applies to full-size ones as well. The first thing that's important is these adjustable backers here. And what this allows us to do is control the reference surface in relation to how much dust collection we're getting. And I think, in my opinion, I want to minimize how open these are, because every time you increase how open they are, while you are going to get a little better dust collection to an extent, too far open and it loses some of its suction, but you're going to get better dust collection, you're also going to have the possibility of leaning in there. And that can be a real problem. Now, obviously with a bearing bit, you're not going to lean in there, but if you're using like a straight bit or something for a groove or a dado, you really don't want to have the accident of leaning into there. You also don't want to have the accident of leaning in just a little bit and then hitting this side on the way out and getting stuck. So I highly advise keeping these as close together as you can while also still getting your dust collection, because it's closer to just being a flat surface to run across in which you have no chance of accidentally leaning in. Now, in regards to these adjustable faces, there's also a lot of pitch buildup that will happen on these that you should pay attention to and clean off, because it can actually build up and cause your workpiece to hit that as it goes through. If you've used this, a year, 2 years, stuff like that over time, it will really build up in there and it can be really problematic. The next thing to touch on here is how to use the fence with a bearing bit. And there are two things that you can do here to maximize what part of the bit you want to hit. The first is that if you want to eventually get the full depth of cut, you're going to line the fence with the bearing. And I just take a ruler, I place it up against the bearing, I push in, I close one, and then I kind of roll, and I don't want to be rolling that bit more than just a little bit. I just want to be grazing it. And then I push again. And then after you've locked in the other one, make sure you check it, because sometimes when you lock this in, you can accidentally push it forward a little bit. So always go back, and I like to come forward too much and then go back in, and then just a little check like that, and then tighten. And that will allow you to get the full depth of cut eventually when you've come all the way up on your profile. However, you don't have to do that. A lot of times I don't want the entire profile. I just want a section of the profile. And what you can do in that case is actually bring the fence ahead of the bearing, and now you can raise and lower the bit to just get that little inner side of the sweeping curve. I make a lot of little tiny dowels, and there's no round over bit that really works best for the size I need, but I can use the inside of this curve to get the right one that I want. But if I have the bearing aligned to the fence, it's too big of a cut. I just need the inside corner. So you can actually set a bearing bit behind the fence, the bearing behind the fence, to still get whatever part of the profile you want. It doesn't have to always be perfectly aligned. What you can't do is set the fence behind the bearing, or else you're gonna rock in and rock out. The bearing has to either be flush to the fence or inside of the fence. Now, a lot of people, when they want to put a profile on a square piece of wood, like to use the fence. That's totally fine. I do it most of the time as well. But a lot of times you run into this conundrum of one side has a nice amount of reference, the other side not so much. This gets a little sketchy, and all of a sudden we can really easily run into a serious problem of kickback. So what do we do to address this situation? Well, on some higher end tables, when this is affixed to a rail, you can use a miter gauge, and they're perfectly parallel, and that can work. But most of us are not going to be in that situation. We're not going to have a fence that's perfectly aligned to the miter slot so that we can use the miter gauge. What we need is a backer board. And what this does is it helps us create more reference surface as well as prevent any tear out. So what I like to use as my backer board is 2 3/4 inch pieces of MDF, plywood, whatever glued together. I like it to be a little taller than my average workpiece, and I like it to be a decent size. This one was longer and has been cut down over time because it essentially is preventing tear out by providing a backing surface there. But really the most important part is to extend our reference surface. When we hold these two pieces together, instead of having only this amount, we've now got this much, and that makes it far more stable to have that amount. In the cases you're doing this to, you're also going to want to close your faces as much as you can and still leave them open to get some dust collection, but you really want to minimize. What you absolutely would like to avoid is having the doors open wider than this piece. The way I like to do this is I like to grab my paddles, and then you're going to feed through, and you're going to come across, and you're totally in contact that whole time, and we have no problem going through. Without that, this is real hard to balance. I immediately ran into the side wall there because I'm not holding it perfectly steady. There we go. Yep, I hope you saw that. I hope you saw the dip in the back there. As soon as, there it is, right there. That's what will happen. But with the backer board, you can avoid that by just having a nice tight grip on that and going all the way through. Up next, we have some accessories that I really like to use with the router table. Now, the first are paddles instead of a push stick, though there are cases where a push block can be useful. I think for most things, a set of paddles is best. Now, these are just made at home by myself, and I hope you can see that I like to put an angle on them so that when I'm standing off in front, it's actually going down and in because we're pushing our piece into something. Think of it like a table saw, where normally on a table saw you want to have pressure from this outside here, but because we're standing in front of the table, we can't kind of stand off to the side like we would on a table saw, so we need our inward pressure to come from the outside. I like to put some sandpaper on the bottom of these, and these are just a little piece of 1/2 inch plywood, some 2x4, and it's doweled through there. Up next is some kind of hose to connect to your dust collection. Now, if you bought the Craig table, and I imagine a lot of benchtop tables are like this, the 2 1/4 hose will fit on the inside. That's your common rigid shop vac size hose. It slides right in there, and it's a real good fit, and you can pull a good amount of dust out the back of this. I also like to have a stop. Now on the Craig table, you get T-track here and up top here. Now they sell their own stop, flip stop, which can be used from the top, but I just have these little tiny T-bolts and little T-nuts, and they sit in there like that. And what you can do with this is cut a groove that does not go all the way through, or just anything that does not go all the way through. You want somewhere to stop, and that allows you to hit your area, and you know that you're not going to go any farther. Some people will just make a mark with pencil and try to line it up by eye, but I really like having a positive stop. After that, we have the classic feather board, commonly used at the table saw. I just happen to use Craig's brand. They sell a pack of 2. It obviously works well with this. Fits a normal table saw. Anything that fits a normal miter slot is going to fit a normal miter slot if that is on your router table. And this just really helps us keep workpieces against the fence, especially if they're large enough that we can't have our pressure in all of the places we want at the same time. Normally when we're feeding something through, we like to have pressure on the inside there, and as we transfer through, then we've got to now transfer some pressure into here so that we're on both sides, and as we pass, our pressure is now going to be on this side so that we don't tip in. But if you're using something very long, you're not going to be able to be up there to have that pressure. Well, the featherboard allows you to create that pressure like a third hand, and it allows you to carry that pressure there while you're still back here. These also can be applied if you have the Craig table to the top here to help keep, well, it would actually go this way, to the top here to keep a workpiece nice and flush on the table. Again, very helpful if the workpiece is larger and you can't be in all of the places you want to be at the same time when you're trying to apply your pressure or keep something up against the fence. I highly suggest having at least one, though having 2 is very nice. After that, we've got, and I believe I touched on this earlier, the on-off switch. Now this one is sold by Craig to go with their table, but Rockler sells like $30 paddle ones. And I highly suggest getting one of these that you can mount somewhere to the outside, not just to make it easier, but to make it safer so that you don't have to reach under the table, and so that if for any reason you ever cannot get your hand off and blindly reaching under there, you can just knee the thing. These on-off paddles, I think, are not, well, I don't want to say necessary. I think they're incredibly highly useful and encouraged on router tables. After that, and I guess this isn't necessarily an accessory, but I think buying the right bits. And in this case, the best bit that you can afford. And what I highly suggest doing, and I know this is contrary to what some people believe, is I don't mind starting out with a set of the cheap yellow Amazon Chinese ones. I actually have a lot of those bits. And what I do is I go through those, and then I find out if I use a certain bit a lot. I found myself using the straight bits in there all the time. What I did is I then went and spent money on a Whiteside bit. Whiteside, Amana, Freud, there are a lot of good router bit manufacturing companies, but these are not cheap. I think this single spiral bit is like $33 or something like that. That's a lot for a single router bit. They can get much more expensive than that. But for me, that's a lot for a single bit. But I was using it all the time. I wanted something that was even sharper and cut even cleaner, and I decided to upgrade. But I don't have a Whiteside roundover bit. I just use the cheap Chinese yellow ones. So in terms of, I guess I'd call them an accessory, investing in the right bits when you really need the right bit is kind of important, and I think will improve your experience. And the last kind of accessory is a bit of a luxury, and that's having some kind of dust collection under the table. There are a lot of cuts where your workpiece is over the bit, and this back dust collection here just, it can't do anything. There's no dust that's going up and out, and it's all going to go straight down. And it's going to cause a huge mess. It's not going to be great for your health to be in the shop. Now, I had to build my own because Craig, unfortunately, does not sell one. I don't know why. And I've written them an email in the past asking them why on earth do they sell such a great router table, but no router dust box. Anyways, either build your own or buy one and try to retrofit it to fit this table, or if your table has an option to buy one, highly suggest it. It's a world of difference when you can have something collecting all the dust that goes down. It's better for your health, and you don't have to spend forever cleaning it all up. The next thing I'd advise for anyone new to a router table is once you've got your bearings with some basic tasks, go ahead and start making some jigs. box joint jigs, spline jigs. Both of these things are great for the router table. There's a variety of jigs you can make. I use MDF, it's much cheaper, and you can go wild with all kinds of different jigs. Make use of the miter bar so that if your benchtop style is like mine and it doesn't have a rail, you can still run jigs in a straight line without having to run them up against the fence. I really like the dovetail spline look, and I think that can be a lot of fun for mitered boxes. So grab some MDF and check that out. One thing I'll advise is that the thicker you make your base, the higher your cutter needs to be. So if you're going to use 3/4 inch like mine, you're going to want, let's say on a spiral bit, an inch long or higher cutter. So take that into consideration when making your jigs. But go wild, these are a lot of fun, and you can really improve the look of some of your boxes. And to end this, we're going to go over just a few what I would consider miscellaneous ones. I don't really have a good category to fit them in, but they were things that I thought of that I really wish I knew early on. The first one is going to involve flush trim routing. And that's something that the router table can do that really no other tool can do, or I should say the router can do that no other tool can really do as efficiently, and that's copy something. You take a template or one piece you've already made, you affix it to another piece, and you can just copy that shape exactly using a flush trim bit. Now there's a variety of flush trim bits. I just use a straight bit. Some of those spiral flush trims get extremely expensive, and while they are very cool and I'm sure they work very well, you absolutely don't have to have one. But there is something I want to cover when it comes to flush trimming. What the problem was is that they left way too much material on here. You really only want to have about 1/8 of an inch or less of material. Normally, if there was something like this, you would either be cutting this out on the bandsaw or with a jigsaw or even by hand. If you leave too much material and you try, let's say this was, instead of being maybe 5/8 inch thick, like 3/4, 7/8, something beefy, you go in there and you hit that and you're not holding on well, it's going straight out the back and it's going to possibly put a hole in something. So make sure you remove the right amount of material down to, I wouldn't leave any more than 1/8 of an inch, and I'd like it to be under that, but I know sometimes when you're on the bandsaw and you're trying to cut out, it gets a little hard to see where you're going, especially if you have a benchtop bandsaw like myself. But just once you pull it out, take a look at it and make sure you don't have a ton left over. The next thing up is that you don't need to place a ton of pressure into the bit. In fact, you really shouldn't. You don't want to put too much lateral force onto the bit, especially if it's something longer, a bearing bit that's quite long. You just want to keep that contact. There's no reason to be leaning into that, right? The reason I like to make my paddles angled is so that I don't have to do any leaning and I can keep that pressure down and in. But just make sure that you don't really lean into that bit, because they can snap and it can throw your router off, and it can also just ruin your profile if you have some kind of wobble in there. So don't go in too hard. Most of our force we want down, and we just want enough in to keep it against the bearing when we're doing some kind of bearing guided pass. And the same thing goes with when you're on your fence. You don't need to cram that thing as hard as possible into the fence. You just want to have enough pressure to keep it up against there. Another tip I would advise is to make yourself some kind of open-topped box. And this may seem a little odd, but there are plenty of times when I'm doing something and I've got a specific height and I have to go do something else really quick. If you leave this uncovered, there's like a good chance you're eventually going to cut yourself. Cover it up. Just put a little box on there. That way there's no way you or anything else can cut yourself on that. And sometimes you also run into the problem, and I've had this problem with some very long straight bits, is that they won't go all the way down. No matter how far down I can put my router on the lift to the bottom, the max of the bottom, it will still stick up a bit, which is dangerous. But sometimes I have to do another step in between, but I need that same positioning to be able to get back to where I am. So I go ahead and I just cover it up, and that's going to really prevent you from cutting yourself or from anything getting snagged on there, or even just hurting the router by it. You know, let's say you think you can just place something on this table and you've forgotten that the bit's there. You don't want to break anything. So go ahead and just make a little box and cover it up. I just want to make one more reminder that if you are going to use any kind of miter gauge, that there are two things you need to think about. The first is that you will need to hold your workpiece down, preferably with some type of clamp. The router bit is going to want to carry it out. It's not like a table saw where the pressure is coming back. So if you're using a miter gauge at all, and I don't think I've ever used one really, I make sleds, but I don't use a miter gauge, make sure you clamp it down. And the other one is that if you are going to use it and you need to use it with your fence, that is the one case where your fence does then need to be parallel to the miter slot. On more expensive tables, they have a rail, they are parallel, but if you're using something like the Craig like mine, where there is nothing that keeps it inherently parallel, you're going to need to make it parallel if you plan to use a miter gauge. So just think ahead before you go in and you start cutting and then you run into the fence because it's a little bit off. And the final tip I have is that the router and the router table especially are a place where you need to have a little bit of confidence in yourself. You want to have a healthy respect of the tool because it is very fast and it does have sharp cutters on it, but it's one of those tools that becomes more dangerous the more timid you get. As long as you've taken all the other safety tips into consideration and you've done your setup right and you've got the right bit and things like that, you want to have confidence, keep a firm but mobile grip down on things so that you can manipulate if you're doing any kind of freehand routing, and you don't want to be jittering. That can be a problem if you're going in and out of the bit at all. I've seen people who jitter a little bit because they're intimidated by the tool, and that will cause the cutter to hit it and then hit it again, and that will want to actually kick it back more. So have a healthy respect, but be confident in your movement because you need to be able to push in through the cutter as the cutter removes material, and you don't want to be losing contact and remaking contact over and over because there's a little bit of timidity in there. That's going to do it for us today. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, I don't know, you want to tell me how your day is going, feel free to do that in the comments. Thank you.